the immortal King of Night was 45 minutes away from turning into a pile of smoking ash. 25 of the world's most elite scholars were weeping in defeat. Then a breathless, heavy-set maid, carrying a bucket of dirty water, stepped over a 2,000-year-old puzzle and solved it in 60 seconds. The supernatural elite of New York City hide in plain sight. They own the penthouse suites, the hedge funds, and the private islands. But above them all sits King Cassian. He is a predator of unparalleled power, a vampire who has ruled the hidden underworld since the fall of Rome. Yet on a freezing Tuesday evening in November, all of Cassian's wealth and power were absolutely useless. He was dying. Deep within the subterranean levels of his Hudson Valley estate, panic had taken hold. A rare, lethal condition, known as the Ashen Rot, had infected Cassian's ancient bloodline. His veins were turning a sickly charcoal color, his skin cracking like dry porcelain. There was only one cure, the legendary Blood Vault of Antioch, a mechanical relic locked behind a puzzle so complex it had remained sealed for 800 years. Inside lay the pure, uncorrupted blood of his sire. If Cassian didn't drink from it by midnight, he would crumble to dust. For 48 hours, the estate had been a revolving door of absolute brilliance. 25 of the most renowned experts in the world had been flown in on private jets. There was Dr. Harrison Fordyce, the leading cryptographer from Oxford University. There was Madame Genevieve, a Parisian blood witch whose lineage dated back to the Salem trials. There were master clockmakers from Switzerland, ancient linguists from the Vatican, and mathematicians who had cracked military codes for the Pentagon. One by one, they stepped up to the massive brass and gold vault door. One by one, they failed. The puzzle was a maddening contraption of weighted scales, glass vials, and shifting gears. The instructions, etched in ancient Aramaic, demanded a perfect balance of fluid and mass to trigger the internal lock. But the scales were overly sensitive, rigged with a fail-safe. If the balance was off by even a fraction of an ounce, the gears seized up. The experts were calculating molecular weight, atmospheric pressure, and lunar gravity. They argued in hushed, terrified voices, their faces slick with sweat, as Cassian's breathing grew more and more ragged on his velvet throne. And then there was Sadie. If the experts were the main characters of this high-stakes drama, Sadie wasn't even an extra. She was part of the furniture. Sadie was 26 years old, a human maid employed by the estate. She was also fat. In a world populated by vampires who prized ethereal skeletal thinness and predatory grace, Sadie was a soft, heavy, and exhausted anomaly. Her uniform was always a little too tight around her thick arms, and her thighs chafed as she climbed the grand, sweeping staircases of the mansion. Her knees ached constantly from the sheer physical labor of scrubbing stone floors, and she was perpetually out of breath. The vampires of the court ignored her entirely. To them she was unappealing. Her high body fat made her blood sluggish in their elitist eyes, which ironically kept her safe from their nocturnal cravings. She was the invisible woman. She existed only to scrub the bloodstains out of the carpets, empty the ashtrays, and keep her eyes glued to the floor. But being invisible has one massive advantage. No one pays attention to you when you are watching them. Sadie was highly intelligent. Poverty and a lack of formal education had kept her scrubbing floors instead of attending college, but she possessed a fiercely practical mind. She had spent her entire life navigating a world built for smaller, richer, faster people. She knew how things fit together. She knew how to distribute weight perfectly when carrying a laundry basket twice her size. She knew the exact structural weak points of the mansion's floorboards, so she wouldn't make a sound. She was a master of the physical, tangible world. As she dragged her heavy mop bucket down the marble hallway toward the subterranean vault chamber, Sadie's heart pounded against her ribs. She was terrified of the vampires, but she had been ordered by the head butler to clean up a shattered glass goblet, that one of the frustrated experts had thrown against the wall. She waddled slightly, the heavy bucket sloshing water against her shins, her chest heaving with exertion. When she pushed open the heavy oak doors to the vault room, the atmosphere was suffocating. The air smelled of ozone fear and the metallic tang of drying blood. King Cassian sat slumped on his throne, his usually terrifying, handsome face pale and cracked like a dry riverbed. His black eyes were clouded with agony. Surrounding the massive brass vault were the remaining experts, looking like a group of wealthy, panicking chickens. "The atmospheric pressure is affecting the liquid density," shouted Dr. Reginald Barrows, a pompous alchemist from London, his silk suit stained with sweat. The Aramaic texts mention the tears of the sun. "We must account for the evaporation rate of the vampire blood in the vials." "You're a fool, Barrows," snapped Professor Evelyn Croft, adjusting her designer glasses. "It's a Fibonacci sequence. The weights must be distributed in a spiral. We just haven't found the exact numerical value of the center gear." Sadie kept her head down. She dragged her bucket into the corner, dropped her aching knees onto the cold stone floor, and began to mop up the shattered glass and spilled wine. But her eyes darted to the massive vault door. She looked at the Antioch mechanism. It was a beautiful, terrifying thing. 3 large glass vials sat on a brass scale, connected by a series of chains and counterweights. The experts had been meticulously pouring drops of thick red liquid into the vials using silver pipettes, trying to get the scale to balance perfectly in the center. But every time they thought they had it, the needle would violently swing to the left, locking the gears with a harsh clang. Sadie wiped her sweaty forehead with the back of her plump arm. She watched Dr. Barrows measure the liquid again. She looked at the vials. She looked at the heavy brass chains. Wait, Sadie thought, her mop pausing on the stone. Are they serious? She squinted her sharp eyes, scanning the contraption. The experts were treating the puzzle like an abstract mathematical equation. But Sadie spent 8 hours a day in the estate's massive kitchens. She baked bread from scratch. She knew that when you weigh flour in old glass jars, the jars themselves are never exactly the same. The 25 geniuses of the world were obsessing over the magical properties of the liquid. They were completely ignoring the physical reality of the containers. The glass vial on the far left was hand-blown. Sadie could see it from 10 feet away. The base was thicker. The glass was warped. It held the same volume of liquid, but the container itself weighed at least 2 ounces more than the others. The scale wasn't failing because the magic was wrong. The scale was failing because the container was heavy. Sadie bit her lip, her heart hammering. "It's none of your business," she told herself. "Keep your head down, fatty. Let the geniuses handle it. If you speak to the king, they'll execute you." But then Cassian let out a low, rattling gasp. A massive chunk of his flesh turned to ash and drifted to the floor. He had 20 minutes left. "Time is up," Barrows screamed, throwing his silver pipette onto the floor in a panic. "The mechanism is flawed. The ancient kings built it as a trap. It cannot be solved." "We need more time." Croft sobbed, her hands covered in the thick red liquid. "If we just recalculate the displacement." Silence. The word was barely a whisper, but it echoed through the massive stone chamber like a thunderclap. King Cassian forced himself to sit upright. Black veins throbbed violently against his throat. Even dying, his presence was overwhelming. He looked at the trembling experts with absolute icy disgust. 25 of the greatest minds. Cassian rasped his voice, sounding like 2 stones grinding together. "And you have given me nothing but noise. Get out." "My lord, please," Barrows started. "Leave me to die in peace," Cassian commanded, his eyes flashing crimson for a fleeting, desperate second. "Guards, remove them." The heavily armed vampire guards stepped forward, their faces emotionless. The experts began to scramble, packing their briefcases and ancient tomes, weeping and muttering in defeat. The room was descending into absolute chaos. Sadie was still kneeling on the floor, clutching her wet rag. Her legs were shaking. Her entire body screamed at her to sink into the shadows, to let the guards herd the humans out, to run back to her tiny servants' quarters and hide. She was just the fat, slow maid. She wasn't supposed to save kings, but as the guards began shoving Dr. Barrows toward the door, Sadie looked at Cassian. For the first time in her life, she didn't see a terrifying, immortal predator. She saw a man in terrible, agonizing pain, and she saw a group of arrogant fools leaving him to die because they were too proud to look at the obvious. Before she could stop herself, her voice rang out. "The glass on the left is thicker." The words cut through the chaotic shouting of the room. Suddenly everything went dead silent. 25 experts, 6 elite vampire guards, and the dying king of night all turned to look at the corner of the room. There knelt Sadie. Her hair was frizzy from sweat, her cheeks flushed bright red, her heavy chest rising and falling rapidly. She looked like a frightened rabbit surrounded by wolves. Dr. Barrows narrowed his eyes, his face twisting into a sneer of profound disgust. "Who let the scullery maid in here? Silence, you ignorant cow! We are dealing with ancient alchemy." A vampire guard hissed, his fangs extending, and took a step toward Sadie to physically throw her out. "Wait." Cassian's voice stopped the guard dead in his tracks. The king slowly turned his head. His dark, sunken eyes locked onto Sadie. For the first time in the 5 years she had worked at the estate, he was actually looking at her. Not through her. At her. "What did you say?" Cassian breathed. Sadie's hands trembled so violently she dropped the wet rag. She forced herself to stand up. Her joints popped in the quiet room. She felt utterly exposed, her large body taking up too much space in a room full of perfection. But she lifted her chin. I said the glass on the left is thicker, Your Majesty." Sadie stammered, though her voice gained a little traction as she pointed a plump, calloused finger at the vault. "They're trying to balance the liquid. But the vial on the left, it's hand-blown glass. See the little bubble near the base, it's uneven. The glass itself is heavier than the ones on the right and center. It doesn't matter how perfect the liquid is. The scale is registering the weight of the thick glass." Dr. Barrows let out a harsh, barking laugh. "Absurd. The Chronos mechanism is a test of spiritual alignment. It has nothing to do with mere glass-making." Cassian ignored the alchemist entirely. His eyes never left Sadie. "And how would you fix it, little bird?" Sadie swallowed hard. She looked at the puzzle. I'd stop pouring blood into it. I'd balance the containers first." Cassian lifted a trembling, ash-covered hand. "Let her approach the vault. My lord, this is a mockery," Professor Croft protested. "She is a servant. She has no training. If she fails, I will kill her myself," Cassian said softly. "Step forward, Sadie." He knew her name. The shock of it almost made her trip over her own heavy feet. Sadie walked toward the center of the room. The scholars parted for her, glaring at her with a mixture of outrage and mocking pity. She approached the massive, intimidating vault. Up close, the gold and brass were blinding. She didn't look at the ancient Aramaic runes. She didn't calculate Fibonacci sequences. She looked at the scale exactly the way she looked at her broken kitchen scale when she was portioning out heavy cream for 50 dinner guests. She reached into the deep pocket of her apron. The experts gasped in horror, expecting her to pull out a mystical artifact. Instead, Sadie pulled out a handful of loose change. She had gotten it from the vending machine in the staff break room 2 hours ago. She selected 2 heavy silver quarters. "What in God's name is she doing?" Barrows whispered frantically. "She's contaminating the relic." Sadie ignored him. She reached out with her thick, capable hands. She didn't touch the liquid. Instead, she gently placed the 2 silver quarters onto the right-hand brass plate of the scale, resting them perfectly against the base of the thinner glass vials. She was counterweighting the heavy glass on the left. She added 1 more dime. For a terrifying, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The room held its breath. Sadie squeezed her eyes shut, terrified she had just signed her own death warrant. Then a sound echoed through the chamber. Click. The heavy brass needle in the center of the scale, which had stubbornly leaned left for 2 days, smoothly slid into the dead center. It held perfectly straight. Deep inside the massive door, heavy steel tumblers began to turn. Thunk, thunk, thunk. The gears that the greatest minds in the world couldn't move suddenly began to spin with a hum of released tension. A rush of stale, ancient air blasted out of the seams. With a heavy groan, the unbreakable vault of Antioch swung open. Exactly 1 minute after Sadie had spoken, the puzzle was solved. Inside the vault rested a glowing crimson chalice, the pure blood of the sire. The 25 experts stood, frozen, their mouths hanging open, in utter, complete disbelief. Dr. Barrows looked like he was going to be sick. They had spent 48 hours trying to hack the code of the universe, and a fat maid in a stained apron had solved it in 60 seconds with 75 cents. Sadie slowly backed away from the vault. Her head bowed her hands, shaking as she buried them back into her apron. King Cassian stared at the open vault. Then slowly, painfully, he turned his dark, mesmerizing eyes back to Sadie. The terrifying, immortal ruler of the night was completely, utterly speechless. The silence in the vault room was so absolute that Sadie could hear the frantic, terrified ticking of Dr. Barrows's platinum pocket watch. King Cassian did not hesitate. Moving with a sudden, desperate burst of strength, he lunged from his velvet throne, his dark cloak billowing like storm clouds. He reached into the open vault of Antioch, his ash-covered fingers wrapping around the glowing crimson chalice. He brought it to his cracked lips and drank. The reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. A shock wave of pure kinetic energy blasted through the subterranean chamber, shattering the remaining glass vials on the table and blowing out every candle in the room. The only light came from the emergency halogens and the faint residual glow of the vault. Before their eyes, the ashen rot retreated. Cassian's charcoal-colored veins flushed with vibrant predatory life. The cracked porcelain texture of his skin smoothed out, returning to a flawless, intimidating marble. His shoulders broadened, the lethal grace returning to his massive frame. When he lowered the chalice, his eyes were no longer clouded with agony. They were a piercing, luminescent crimson. The King of Night was back. Dr. Barrows, trembling violently, fell to his knees. "Praise be to the dark ancestors! My lord, our calculations combined with the final structural shift." Silence. Cassian's voice didn't just echo. It vibrated in their bones. He handed the empty chalice to his lead guard and turned his gaze to the 25 scholars. They were supposedly the brightest minds on Earth, men and women who consulted for the Smithsonian Authenticated Antiquities for Sotheby's and held tenure at Harvard. Yet they cowered like beaten dogs. "You calculated nothing." Cassian said, his voice a low, lethal purr. He walked slowly toward the group, his boots making no sound on the stone floor. "You spent 2 days debating the lunar cycle and atmospheric density while I rotted in my chair. You were blinded by your own arrogance." He stopped in front of Barrows. "And worst of all, you let a human woman, my employee, do what your collective genius could not. My lord, she is just a fat, uneducated scullery maid." Professor Croft cried out, tears ruining her expensive makeup. It was a fluke, a lucky guess with pocket change. Cassian didn't even look at Croft. He gestured to the heavily armed vampire guards waiting in the shadows. "Strip them of their credentials. Wipe their memories of this estate, and throw them out onto the street." Panic erupted. The experts screamed and begged as the immortals dragged them out of the chamber by their expensive lapels. Within seconds, the grand room was empty, save for the guards, the king, and Sadie. Sadie was pressed flat against the cold stone wall, clutching her wet mop rag like a shield. She wanted to shrink, to disappear. In the harsh halogen light, She felt every inch of her heavy body. Her apron was stained with dirty water, her thick thighs ached from kneeling, and her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was a soft, fleshy target in a room built for predators. Cassian turned to her. The predatory edge in his eyes softened into something intensely curious. "Sadie," he murmured, tasting the name on his tongue. "Yes, Your Majesty," she squeaked, keeping her eyes glued to the polished tips of his boots. He closed the distance between them in a blur of motion. Suddenly he was standing mere inches away. Sadie squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the bite, waiting for him to snap her neck to keep the vault's secret safe. Instead, she felt a cool, strong hand gently cup her chin, tilting her face upward. "Open your eyes," he commanded softly. She did. He was breathtakingly close, smelling of winter frost and old leather. "Why did you speak up?" Cassian asked. "You knew the penalty for interrupting the court. You knew those scholars would mock you. You are a human in a house of monsters. Why risk your life?" Sadie swallowed hard. Because you were in pain," she whispered honestly. And they weren't looking at the real world. They were looking at their books. In the kitchen, if a recipe fails, you don't blame the oven's aura. You check if the measuring cup is warped. A slow, mesmerizing smile spread across Cassian's face. It was the first time in centuries he had been genuinely surprised. "The vampires of my court starve themselves," Cassian said quietly, his thumb brushing a stray, frizzy curl from her sweaty forehead. "They chase a skeletal perfection, making themselves brittle, fragile things. They look at you and see a maid who takes up too much space." His eyes darkened with sudden, fierce heat. "But I look at you, Sadie, and I see the only solid, real thing in this entire cursed estate. You have a mind built for the truth." Sadie's breath hitched. A heavy blush rushed to her plump cheeks. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever looked at her size, her weight, her physical presence, and called it real. "Guards!" Cassian called out, his eyes never leaving Sadie's. "Prepare the East Wing Master Suite. Sadie will no longer be cleaning the floors. She will be dining with me." The transition was jarring. Within hours, Sadie was removed from the damp servants' quarters and placed in a sprawling, luxurious suite overlooking the Hudson River. The tight, scratchy maid's uniform was replaced with flowing silk gowns, tailored specifically to her generous curves. For the first time in her life, she was pampered, treated not as background furniture, but as an honored guest. Yet Sadie's practical mind never stopped working. 2 nights later, she was sitting in Cassian's private study. The king was attending a council meeting, leaving Sadie alone with a massive spread of roasted meats, fresh bread, and fruit. She was looking over the incident report from the vault room. Cassian had given her full clearance to read the estate's logs. Her sharp eyes caught a glaring inconsistency. She remembered the way Dr. Barrows had been acting. He hadn't just been arrogant. He had been stalling. He kept demanding they recalculate the liquid displacement, forcing them to wait. Sadie walked over to the evidence table, where the guards had placed the scholars' confiscated belongings before wiping their memories. She picked up Dr. Barrows's leather satchel. Inside, nestled beneath a copy of a Morgan Library historical manuscript, was a small, lead-lined box. Sadie popped the latch. Inside was a syringe and a vial of clear liquid. She smelled it. It didn't smell like magic. It smelled faintly of heavy metals, thallium, and crushed wolf's bane. A highly toxic concoction designed to mimic the symptoms of the ashen rot. The pieces slammed together in her mind. Cassian hadn't contracted a random ancient curse. He had been poisoned, and Barrows was the assassin sent by a rival vampire faction to stall the opening of the vault until Cassian died. Barrows knew the puzzle was flawed by the thick glass. He was using the flawed glass to keep the vault locked on purpose. When Cassian returned to the study an hour later, he found Sadie pacing the floor. Her heavy silk gown, rustling her brow, furrowed in intense concentration. "My practical savior." Cassian smiled, stepping into the room. "Is the food not to your liking?" "You weren't sick," Sadie said bluntly, holding up the lead-lined box. Cassian froze. The warmth vanished from his face, replaced by the lethal predator. "Explain." Sadie laid it out with the same brutal, practical efficiency she used to organize the pantry. She explained the stall tactics, the heavy metal poison in the satchel, and how Barrows had positioned himself to oversee the liquid measurements, ensuring the scale would never balance. "He wasn't an idiot," Sadie concluded, her voice trembling slightly but holding firm. "He was a saboteur. He used the other scholars' arrogance to hide his sabotage. He wanted you to burn." Cassian stared at the vial of poison. The silence in the room was deafening. He realized in that moment that Sadie hadn't just saved his life by accident. Her grounded, observant mind was a weapon sharper than any sword in his armory. He walked over to her. The sheer size and power of the immortal king dwarfed her, yet she stood her ground. He reached out his strong hands, grasping her soft, full waist, pulling her flush against his chest. "They sent 25 experts to watch me die," Cassian whispered, his voice vibrating with raw emotion. "And the universe gave me you, a woman who sees the cracks in the glass, a woman who cannot be fooled by grand illusions." "I'm just Sadie." She breathed, her heart racing as his lips brushed her jawline. "I'm not royalty. I don't belong in this world. You belong wherever I am," Cassian declared, his kiss sealing the promise, fiercely possessing her. He didn't care about the shallow rules of his kind. He didn't care about bloodlines or beauty standards. The next evening, the High Court of New York's vampire elite gathered in the grand ballroom. They expected to see their king weakened. Instead, the doors swung open to reveal Cassian, radiating terrifying, unstoppable power. But it was the woman on his arm that sent a shockwave through the room. Sadie wore a deep crimson gown of Vera Wang silk that hugged her thick curves and draped elegantly to the floor. A heavy diamond diadem rested in her frizzy dark hair. She was soft, she was heavy, and she was absolutely radiant. "Boo!" Cassian's voice boomed across the ballroom, echoing with undeniable authority. "Bow to the woman who outsmarted the world. Bow to your new queen." And slowly, one by one, the immortal predators fell to their knees before the maid who had changed the world with 75 cents. Did Sadie's incredible intellect and unexpected romance leave you completely speechless? Sometimes, the greatest heroes are the ones the world ignores, proving that true power lies in a practical mind and a courageous heart. If you loved watching this brilliant maid outsmart the experts and claim a vampire king's heart, smash that like button. Don't forget to share this story with your friends who love a juicy plot twist, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling supernatural dramas.